Feeding our babies is supposed to come naturally. We see images of cooing babies and smiling moms and doting grandmas and expect that to be us. We don't see all the struggle that goes into every decision that seems so high stakes at the time. We don't expect all the leaking, the engorgement, the deciding to take a break. We don't expect all the judgment, whether we breastfeed or bottle feed or pump or don't. Or maybe we do expect all those things and it comes smooth sailing. But what I have encountered as a doula, a childbirth educator, and a lactation professional is that when I tell people what I do, the stories flow out naturally. And I love hearing them. I hope you do too. I'm your host, Lo. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes.
Hi, Kerry. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you decided to be on the podcast and share your stories.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as we begin, I would love for you to introduce yourself and your family.
Okay. My name is Kerry. I homeschool my kids. They are currently, 19, not almost 18 and 7.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So the first two have been growing up very much together, only 20 months apart. And then 10 years later, we discovered that we can, in fact, get pregnant again.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So I can't wait to hear all about your baby feeding stories. Before we get into those, what was your exposure to breastfeeding, baby feeding before you actually had your first child? 19.
Yeah. So I remember being pregnant with the first one, and I was very close friends with somebody who had 4 children, very, very close in age. The first one turned 4 the day after the fourth one was born. And it was a very intense friendship. And she had out of those 4, one good breastfeeding experience. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll give it a try. And, we'll see if we can make it to 6 months. And I asked my significant other, and after about 20 minutes or 30 minutes of caveats of it's your body and you should do what you want and what you're comfortable with. Yeah, I know. I asked your opinion. He finally came out and said that, it'd be lovely if you tried for like a year. And I was like, well, we'll see if we even make it to 6 months. And what I didn't know before having a baby, was that the only hard part is the beginning when you're figuring it all out. And then after that, you can kind of keep going forever. I had not been to any kind of breastfeeding groups. I'm in Boston, and at that time, at least, the La Leche League group for Boston was kind of weird and hard to find and hard to get into. There is also the Nursing Mothers Council, Nursing Mothers something, and we at that time I hadn't actually heard of them. So like I kind of went into it with the idea that it just was like really hard work, but it was, worth trying. See if I can make it work.
Okay. So you had that one friend who had some experience breastfeeding. You talked to your partner who said, yes, I think you should try for a year. Was there anything else that shaped your goals?
I knew my mother had breastfed me and my sister, although she hadn't really talked about that much. She had been a younger mother, and I was born in 72. So there was like a baby book where like 3 weeks in, she kept getting instructions from the pediatrician to start solids. And she was like, and would ignore it and continue breastfeeding us.
Wow.
I had another friend whose first was born 4 months before my first was born. And so but she didn't like share any of her journey or experience. And then everybody else I was friends with had kids after my first.
Okay.
So there were a lot of people that were pregnant.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Or pregnant shortly after, but.
Yeah. And so 19 years ago, that would have been like 2001, 2000, what year?
2002.
2002.
Yeah.
Okay. So you had a baby in 2002, and then you had a baby in like 2004, maybe?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then 7 years ago, So I'm interested to hear how your birth experiences were different and how your feeding experiences were different in terms of the support you got in the immediate postpartum time, and maybe the information that was out there for you. We know that uh, the feeding outcomes are impacted by the birth experience. So this is not a birth centered podcast, but we know we have to hear about birth experiences to then know what happened for the feeding. So if you want to tell us your birth experiences, a brief synopsis.
So the first two were both born by unwanted, unnecessary C-section. My obstetrician was she did things her way, and that was that there was a lot of trauma that as a result of the coercion and deception. So my first was a scheduled C-section the Friday before a 3-day weekend, which meant that the only breastfeeding, the only lactation consultant on staff, because I only had one at that time, worked Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and therefore was going to be gone until Tuesday, which would be the day that I was supposed to be leaving. At that time, the concept of a natural C-section or a gentle C-section was not a thing. So it was basically, you're shaved and rolled in and sliced open, and the baby and they pretty much always cut the baby in a C-section. It's just usually it's very little. This time, because that child was breech, they cut a butt cheek, and they needed to seal that up with liquid stitches or super glue. And so the infant was placed in like an isolette across the room from me for like a good long time. I didn't know anything about the idea of like getting the baby to the breast within the first hour. So, and nobody suggested that or encouraged that at all. There was, but we were going to try. So, I'm all out of my gourd on pain medicine that's not doing anything for the pain, but is making me completely loopy. And the baby is hysterical by the time that they're presenting her to me. And I knew I could figure out enough, like a hysterical baby was not going to be able to do this. The nursing staff that was stuck with having to work over the long weekend were probably lower on the totem pole, but definitely were counterproductive at the time. It was pretty much a recipe for disaster. We weren't getting anywhere. And my milk obviously wasn't coming in right away. And they gave the baby a bottle of formula, which I found crushing at the time. Like here, my body hadn't been able to give birth, and now I can't even breastfeed. And then it was Tuesday morning, and we were actually able to get the lactation consultant to come, and she was phenomenal. She was able to talk us through getting latched on properly, figuring it out, what to expect, what not to expect, etc.
I started the Milk Making Minutes because I'm passionate about supporting breastfeeding people. But more importantly, I knew that hearing real people tell real stories would benefit both the storytellers and the listeners. I had this idea for 3 years before I launched. I asked so many people how I should begin, and Anchor came up repeatedly as the easiest way to launch a podcast. And I have not been disappointed. If you are passionate about a topic and have wanted to start a podcast, you can use Anchor to record and distribute your podcast. It's easy to use. You can use the editing tools right from the platform. You can distribute your podcast episodes seamlessly to listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from Anchor. And the best part is, it's free. And the tech support has been great too. Go to anchor.fm or download the app right to your phone to get started on your great podcast idea. So I would like to know, were you getting any immediate postpartum help with breastfeeding over that 3-day weekend while in the hospital with your first?
No. From the time of the C-section, the focus at that time, the sort of state of mind of the nurses seemed to mostly be to protect the poor, beleaguered mother who just gave birth, who just went through a C-section,
Mm.
from the demands of breastfeeding. And so
Oh.
there was no conversation about getting the baby to the breast. There was no offer. They sort of discouragingly recognized that I had said I wanted to breastfeed and would bring the so we try to keep the infant with us as much as possible, but then they would they had a midnight thing where they would take all the babies to do the daily measurements and whatnot, and there was like a change of shift. And so then as you're waiting for, they're like, oh, we'll come right back with the baby, it's fine. And then, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you hear the mouth of hell screaming at you as it's coming down the hallway because the child is that
Oh my
distressed.
gosh.
My
Wow.
children are also born with very, very powerful lungs.
Hmm.
Um, there was no mistaking which one was mine. Every other newborn was, mine roared. But so you come back with this hysterical infant, and I remember um, I don't know if it was the first night or the second night, but the nurse came in with her and sort of trying to shove this hysterical baby at a breast.
Oh wow.
And I'm, woken from a dead sleep and confused and discombobulated. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, um, there's no way this is a successful way to
Mm.
do this. I had no
Yeah.
background or preparation for it. I hadn't done any of the smart things of hung out with nursing groups or nursing parents or whatnot. But I remember just being like, this is not viable. And I said something to her about, I don't think it's going to work with the baby, this hysterical. And so the nurse literally threw the baby at me, like the baby was in the air between us,
No.
um, and was, I'm just trying to help, and stomping around and doing, I don't remember what else she needed to do. And, I realized this was the same person who was in a few hours going to be removing the catheter.
Oh
And
wow.
it being my first catheter, I was suddenly terrified. So I tried to find a way to make amends or apologize in my completely groggy state. So I said something along the lines of, I'm really sorry. I'm not usually awake at this time of day, so I don't, I'm not completely coherent. And she just continued, I'm just trying to help, and rah, 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 and stormed out.
Wow.
In good news, the catheter removal was fine. That went okay. But we didn't get anywhere with the baby, with the nursing at that point. There was one nurse on my last night and morning there who really wanted to be helpful. She was very sweet, but she didn't necessarily know much more than I did. She knew that they
Mm.
had a hospital grade pump. And at that point my breast milk had come in, so my poor boobs had become mountainous and rock hard
Mm.
and all that kind of fun stuff. And she so she brought in the hospital grade pump and was all excited for it. Um and mostly the biggest help she had a lot of bad advice. Not It was well intended advice, but bad advice. And but she did chase down the lactation consultant and brought her in. And that was what made all the difference.
Mm.
That um that last morning, being able to I found out later from a friend that lactation consultant was like one of the three best consultants in the greater Boston area, kind of thing, or something. I mean, it
Mm.
was
Mm-hmm.
completely by accident. She was the only one on staff at the hospital at the time, so she worked basically 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, with the usual Monday holidays off and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um and
Wow.
so yeah.
So how was baby feeding in those few days while you were waiting to get that help?
It wasn't a lot. I mean, there was a lot of, generally, like, I know the baby and the boob go together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we tried to put them together, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there was success. I remember one time I was very excited because the baby had nursed for like 10 minutes, and I I told a nurse in the hall, and she looked at me very disparagingly and was like, they need to be nursing for, 20 minutes on each side. And I remember being blank. I'm pretty sure that's not right. Like, I didn't say it out
Mm.
loud, but I was thinking, there's no way that makes sense for newborn. Like, sure, at a certain point, maybe, but, and particularly that first baby was a guzzler. I mean, actually, they were extremely messy eater, except when it came to ice cream on a hot day. Um, right through childhood. As a matter of fact, to this day, if there's rice at dinner, their plate, although they're almost 20, and my youngest, who's now 7, are going to have a similar distribution of rice around it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, you
well,
can see that right there at the beginning.
right. Yeah, I mean, and I kind of was a bit of a geyser, so it was a good combination.
Hmm.
But like 20 minutes on each side was not,
Just
and,
wasn't happening.
and
Yeah.
that nurse, I mean, she didn't, I assume she didn't intend to be rude or nasty or negative, but she didn't have any accurate information. She'd heard somewhere this figure and then had held on to it in a vacuum of lack of information, and so she believed it to be true as opposed to like a truth.
Right.
Like maybe
Instead
that's
of
true for
looking
some
at
people, but
you and your
newborns are,
baby. Right.
yeah, newborns vary so much that it doesn't make any
Hmm.
sense to be like, this is the only way that it's successful.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so then what was that like for your next two children? One that you had very soon after, and then one that you had years
So
later.
just
Did that
the sort of
postpartum support vary at all?
the wrap up with that first one, though, was that lactation consultant totally got us sorted out. And
Great.
from
Before you left the
that day,
hospital.
yeah, right
Okay.
before we left. From that day on, for years, like, nursing was very, very easy with that one. I mean, there's
Mm.
a lot of other things, like there wasn't any particular problems. It was just not knowing what to do and not having gotten started right away and not and all those kinds of things going on.
So was it more informational support that she gave you, or was it more helping you figure out how to get comfortable? Was it more helping you learn how to tune in to the baby? What was it that she did in that short amount of time that helped everything? Now this doesn't happen for everybody, right? But for
Right.
you and your baby, that's how it worked out, that all you needed was a little bit of time with somebody who could help you. So what types of supports did she provide that made it work for you for so
Okay,
long
so
afterwards?
we're drawing on a groggy 20-year-old memory, but
I know, right?
I've never really asked myself that question specifically. I remember her talking us through it as opposed to putting her hands on me and the baby, because her thing
Mm.
was, yeah, and she could have, like, if we were in a
Yeah,
really, if we really needed it, but in the um in the setting that we were in, she's like, okay, you're going to go home and I'm not going to be there, so me putting the baby on is not helpful, so
exactly.
we're going to do, and she talked me through um getting this sort of, the jargon is the proper positioning and latch, but like, she talked me through what that meant on a physical level, like, how to hold the baby, how to position my body, how to position the baby's body, how to position the baby's mouth and the breast. And this was all based on the best practices 20 years ago. Because I remember
Mhm.
um, she and I worked together over the years for a while, and the best practices kept changing. Um, so, but at that time, that was, she one of the things was trying to hold the baby in sort of the usual cradle hold, where you've got the baby's head in your elbow, and she talked about like why that's not necessarily the easiest way to control the baby's head with your elbow versus say with a hand where we have more control.
Mhm.
um so the that was a big part of what she was able to do, and also dispelling some of the misinformation that was provided um, during my stay with the
Okay.
other nurses.
Okay. So just helping you understand a little bit more about how milk supply works, and those weird things that were being told to you about it must be 20 minutes per breast and those kinds of
Yeah,
things, and helping
yeah.
you
I mean,
tune into
she,
baby's hunger
noted
cues.
that I had a very strong letdown,
Uh-huh.
and as a result, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be particularly long. As long as the
Mhm.
baby's full, the baby's full.
Mhm.
so on.
Yeah.
So we had been breastfeeding comfortably, and then the baby was a year, and I was like, well, neither she nor I particularly want to stop, so let's not. And then we found out that we were already pregnant.
Oh, wow.
Well, with baby number 2. Yeah, turns out I used to have a joke that not only can you get pregnant at 4 o'clock in the morning, but if it seems like a good idea, honey, you're getting pregnant at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so, so then I was sort of faced with like, oh no, we don't necessarily want to stop breastfeeding. We did want a second child, although we had just decided we were going to wait another year, and Mother Nature laughed at us. And so I was kind of looking into stuff and fell into the phrase tandem breastfeeding or tandem nursing, and came across a book called Adventures in Tandem Breastfeeding, which provided a ton of great, easy language information that was very helpful, because that same OB, obstetrician, had started in with misinformation. Like, oh, if you don't wean the current baby, you'll lose the pregnancy.
Oh, wow.
No, that's not how that works. The milk won't be right. The this, the that, the other. Like, it just, there was all kinds of, and so I had enough information to be able to handle the myths and misinformation I was being handed at the time, which
So you felt confident continuing breastfeeding despite the information you were being given by your care provider.
Absolutely. And I mean, my milk did in fact dry up, and towards the end of the pregnancy, and I remember dry nursing being extraordinarily uncomfortable. And so they
Which is
do
why
very,
a
very
lot of people stop. People who are low risk, they end up stopping because it's painful, and they don't see the nurse.
Right. And so, like, I would sit down with the just barely more than a baby and to breastfeed, and I'd kind of hold on to it as long as I could, and then give, like, okay, you have 1 minute, and then like 10 seconds later, okay, we're done.
Right.
It might be part of that in playgrounds of a similar sort of way. It might be why my children have no sense of time. Entirely my fault. But we and then we were yet again in the same hospital, not quite 2 years after the first time. But now I had a different perspective. Like, I now knew about the idea that if you put the baby even just on the chest within the first hour, all kinds of instincts are play in your favor. And so going into a second C-section, I was telling them that this is what I wanted to do, and they're like, well, if you want. I was like, I'm going to want.
Right.
Don't you worry, I'm going to want. I remember one point I was holding the baby in my arms, and the nurse came in. She's like, oh, you're going to drop the baby on the floor and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, because I was in the hospital bed. And I looked at her, I was like, this is not my first baby. She's like, oh. So she lifted up the little guardrail that's intended to keep an adult from falling out, but has holes that are significantly larger than the baby.
Right.
Like, okay, whatever makes you happy. It's fine.
Right. Yeah. And this was after you had the C-section and you were asking to hold the baby right away.
Right. Well, it was throughout that hospital stay. There would be all these kinds of little incidents.
Okay. So
there was,
did they, quote unquote, allow you to take baby skin to skin immediately with that second?
No, there wasn't so with the first C-section, they had given me Demerol immediately after the surgery, and it had not been successful. Like, I could feel all the pain, I just couldn't communicate. I was like trapped in a body that was not functional. And so with the second one, I was like, I really don't want to do that again. So they had tried something else and it didn't work at all. So that first hour I was not in a place where I could remove the Johnny sufficiently to have put skin to skin, but I had the baby in my arms at my chest. Actually started nursing. Well, the spinal was wearing off and the medication wasn't kicking in yet. That was fun. And then eventually we switched to a different pain solution that was reasonably successful, although
I did itch. But yeah, they did allow, as you say, quote unquote, like they did make allow me to do that. There was it was that we were much more vigilant about keeping this baby with us and not letting it
Hmm.
sort of drift off into their care.
Okay.
So, um,
Which it was a very different culture 18 years ago, 19 years ago in hospitals.
I
Now
mean,
it's pretty standard fare for babies to remain in the rooms with
right, like it was supposed to
parents.
be rooming in was the norm,
Hmm.
but then they had to take them all away to do the measuring and the weighing and whatnot.
Right.
But then they would return them when it was convenient or when the infant was hysterical.
Right. And at that time, there still might have been a lot of nursing staff who, even if regulations had changed, they might not have caught up in their own
Right.
practice. If
Yeah,
hospital
practice.
policies had changed, if they had been doing something for 15 years a different way, it doesn't mean that they were going to right away switch to what the
Oh,
regulation
definitely. The head
was.
of
Yeah.
obstetric nursing taught our childbirth education class, and I remember because it was pretty horrifying. Her talking about like how they used to do birth with like uh, basically the birthing person would be out of their gourd on these medications that would not decrease pain at all, but would completely make them insensible, and like they basically strap them to beds, and like she had been practicing back under in a different decade, shall we say. She also talked about that as not being good, and that more natural birth and whatnot, and the various options that the way they were doing things more recently was much better. She was not in favor of going backward, but definitely the nursing staff um, had experience with different decades of practice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and so my poor partner, would um, he'd be with us all night, and then go take go pick up my mother was staying with the toddler, the 2-year old, almost
Hmm.
2-year old,
Hmm.
and overnight, and he would go get her ready, take her to her daycare provider, and then I think he had to work, and then go pick her up and bring her to the hospital. My mother would come meet us, and then he would take them home, make them all dinner, settle her into bed. My mother would stay with the baby for the night, and then he'd come back to the hospital to take care of me and the newborn
Hmm.
overnight.
And how
And
long was that hospital stay for you?
I mean, it was the usual C-section, so it was the 4 or 5
4 or 5
days,
days. Okay.
like 4.5 days, whatever it is.
Hmm.
They but at midnight when they'd come to pick up the baby, he'd hop out of bed as if he'd been awake the whole time. He'd be like, "Oh, I'll just come with you and bring her right back." No, no,
Mm-hmm.
that's fine. You don't need to. No, no, it's no problem. I was up anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
As a way to
so
make sure the baby came back quickly.
right, so that
Hmm.
because this baby did not guzzle.
Hmm.
This infant would kind of be there for long periods of time and like pinch things shut, because in addition to already being a bit of a um, geyser, I had been breastfeeding a toddler and therefore breastfeeding a lot more milk, and so this one like really pinched it shut so they wouldn't be gagging on the milk coming in, which was fun. um,
Yeah.
they spent a lot more time nursing as a result.
Yeah. And did you get any abrasions or any sores as a result of that pinching?
Nah, it just kind of pinched. It was
Okay.
okay. Like
Okay.
um, everything else was good. It just like we would fix it and the baby would do it again. I was like, okay, you're doing this on purpose. I understand. It's fine. Like it is
Yeah.
what it is, and it got better.
Okay. Did you figure out any positions or anything that worked better for that baby to be able to control the flow of milk?
Not particularly, mostly because most of the time I was breastfeeding both of them at the same time because
Mm.
the older one was only 20 months old,
Mm-hmm.
and so um, we and had always sort of nursed in one particular position, although on either side. And so then I'd sort of stick the baby on top of the toddler,
Mm-hmm.
um, and nurse them that way. So it was more about kind of how to accommodate so many bodies.
Okay.
And it got easier mostly because they got older and things sort of settled down and that kind of thing. But as a result, we didn't have the same kind of full to bursting when my milk came in. It came in a little bit more sort of even, and then there was also a toddler that was more than happy to get some real milk again.
Mm-hmm. And how did you manage? Were you concerned about weight gain with either child ever?
With the first one, there was the night before my milk came in. The nurses insisted that because the baby was almost at 10% loss or whatever that cutoff is, that they had to
Mm-hmm.
give a bottle, and they very forcefully, belligerently were like, the baby needs the bottle, this isn't about you, blah blah blah. um and So that was the one time that it was an issue, and then weight gained right to just fine once my milk came in. With the
Mm.
second one, the weight loss had been much less, or had been less, maybe not
Mm-hmm.
much less, because it really wasn't that much to start with.
Okay.
um so it didn't and like I said, the nursing had gone more smoothly the whole way through and that kind of thing.
Okay. And you always tandem fed uh, simultaneously from the once you got home with the infant. It was typically that you were feeding both the infant and the toddler simultaneously,
Not
or
always,
okay.
but certainly free. So they slept at opposite times.
Mm.
So sitting down on the couch with my feet on the coffee table and the two babies attached and my head back was
Mm-hmm.
kind of what was an important bit of rest.
Mm-hmm.
um Obviously the newborn nursed more often. The older one certainly ate plenty of table food, so um it wasn't all the time or anything, but
Okay.
it certainly happened often.
Okay. And you were never concerned about the infant's weight gain, so you never had to worry managing, making sure the infant had milk first and then the toddler could nurse because it was never a concern for your baby.
No, actually, I kind of overproduced, which, I mean, I also went back to work with both of them and then did not respond very well to the pump. So, like, I
Mm.
responded okay-ish.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be there 4 days a week part time, and then some other hours from home, and I'd pump, every day that I was there, plus additional times from home, in order to get through those few days until they were about a year. But even before I started intentionally pumping, there was enough extra after two babies to still pump and put it in the freezer, um, to stock up a bit. So that was one of the things that I hadn't specifically learned to be afraid of insufficient milk supply, um, and instead I learned that, like, generally speaking, milk supply should be more than sufficient. It's when we do things that inadvertently um, teach our body to produce less
Mm-hmm.
that we often have issues, or if we measure it by the wrong scale, if we're like measuring how much we get by the breast pump as opposed to how much is actually going into the baby, that kind of thing, that we get the
Mm-hmm.
impression we have poor milk supply, but that for most people milk supply is not actually an issue, so it never occurred to me to worry about it.
Yeah. And so tell me about what that was like going back to work. What ages were your children, were your babies when you went back to work both
So the
times?
joys of living in the US, where capitalism is king. I was so with my first, I found out right away that we were pregnant, but I didn't know how maternity leave worked, and so I did
Mm,
not have sufficient paid time off because they didn't pay you for time off. Um,
right.
and so um, I so with that one, I think, like, we cut down my weekly paid hours to something like 12 a week or whatever to get through the time period or something like that. With the second one, we found out I was pregnant almost at the end of the first trimester. As we were, the day that we were getting on a plane for a 4-week trip to Greece, where my partner's family is, to have the first one baptized and meet that side of the family and all that kind of thing. So I came back having used up all my vacation time. And I had already established being able to work from home for part of my hours. And so we had, I think the C-section with the second one was like on a Wednesday, and the following Monday I was at a computer working part-time hours from home to make it through. Because it wasn't so much that I was worried about not having the pay, but if you didn't have at least some hours on the books, then you weren't employed, kind of a thing, or something weird like that. I don't know. But there was a big kerfuffle about that. So yeah, I was working a few days after the second one was born.
A few days, you said?
Yes, from home.
Okay.
Yep, sitting at my computer.
Wow.
It was wild.
Wow.
Do not recommend.
No, of course not. After having had a C-section at that, with a toddler and an infant, and the toddler was still going to daycare, but you had the infant there at home with you while you worked?
We had to keep the toddler at the in-home daycare provider one day a week, or she said we would lose the spot. And so we would take the toddler there one day a week. So I had the infant. And then the other day, I think I was working 2 days a week, not full days, but a certain number of hours. And the toddler, and then the toddler would be home the other day of the week.
Okay. Wow. But anyone, most people have now experienced, or many people have now experienced what it's like to work from home with children in tow. So most people now know it's not, it's not as idyllic as many people might think. And especially having just had a baby and navigating, even in the easiest, least complicated scenarios, establishing a breastfeeding dynamic with an infant is still challenging. And so doing that while having to start.
In some ways, the toddler was a huge benefit, because that child absolutely had to get out of the house twice a day, every day, come hell or high water, or everyone would suffer. Not in a mean way, just very high energy toddler. And so I was out in the sun around people at playgrounds twice a day, even if it wasn't a particularly long period of time. It helped. There was a lot of benefit to. I don't remember a lot from those years, because they did sleep at different times for a good year or two after the birth of the second one.
Yes.
And the first one didn't sleep well at all to start with. So there were a good several years of very little sleep and a few fender benders. But so yeah, I mean, like, it was what it was. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say, but it wasn't easy. The breastfeeding made it much better, in both cases, both with the postpartum depression and with juggling 2 children that slept at different times and the different needs and whatnot. Every time we would leave the house, the baby would fall asleep as we were like getting in the car, and then wake up again, having been out the whole time, as we were going back into the house. So we sort of had a theory that one's view of the world was our apartment, the stairwell, the inside of the car, the stairwell, and the apartment.
Aww. But that gave you a chance to kind of tune into your toddler, I'm sure, too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the toddler was very physically capable, so I had already demonstrated to me that following them around the playground was not productive for them, that they didn't need it nor want it. Not, like, it was all good. It just, they were busy doing their thing, and I just kind of, being a big old adult, got in the way.
Yeah. And you mentioned pumping for the toddler and the infant while you were working. So was there ever a time where you were required to go back into the office or back into whatever work environment you worked at?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. After the 12 weeks, I was back at
Okay.
work. I still worked some of my hours from home.
Okay.
Initially, it was a very weird schedule, and then later it was more a 1 day a week from home. Um, and but yeah, I would so I'd be in the office part time, and I would the one break I would take would be to go pump. There was a pumping room upstairs in a sort of like oversized, what would have been an oversized closet off of the women's room, um, that I used. And then we were changing offices, and I expressed concern because, now to pump would involve cutting across the whole area to get to a different building and that kind of thing. And so they built in a pumping room to the new
Mm.
office structure, which was very cool.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, I, it took so long to do the build out of the new office in general that the second baby was done with pumping long before we moved.
Oh,
So
wow.
it wasn't a thing for me, but
But that
I was,
space was available for other people then.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you said you would pump while you were at work
Mhm.
once during your work time. How many hours were you away?
Um, there were a lot of different schedules over those years. I only pumped and gave bottled milk for about till they were about 11, 12 months.
Okay.
At that point, they'd moved to enough table food that didn't worry
You
about it
didn't
when we
have to
weren't together. And
provide
then
it.
they continued breastfeeding for years after. But
Yes.
in terms of the pumping, I did diminish that a bit.
Yes.
Uh, so, for example, um, I might go into work earlier and my partner take them to the daycare or preschool, and then I would leave work on the earlier side and go pick them up. So maybe a 6 hour day, 4 days a week in the
Okay.
office, and then another day from home,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, or a 5 hour day, something like that. Like I tended to, it shifted around. Sometimes I was the one who did the drop off and he did the pickup.
Okay.
Um, we tended to try and split the shifts a little bit
Yeah.
to decrease how long they were at daycare and how long, or preschool, and how, as well as, yeah, like how, how long we were apart from them, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So it was about once within a 5 to 6 hour window of being away. You would.
Right. And then I would pump in the morning.
Uh-huh.
I would try to aim it for before they breastfed,
Mm-hmm.
because of that happy piece of information that the baby will be much more efficient at getting the body to make more breast milk.
Mm-hmm.
Like just stick with it. They'll get their breakfast. It's fine. But the the pump was not nearly as effective. So
Mm-hmm.
I would try to take advantage of whatever early morning I could.
And at that time, were you able to get insurance coverage for a pump, or did you pay out of pocket? Do you remember?
I did. That wasn't a thing that was really talked about back then, so I don't even know if it was an option. We just
Okay. You just.
and the pump that worked the best for me was actually a hand pump. It had the little silicone liner on the
Uh-huh.
flanges, so that everything else, whether hospital grade or battery operated or whatever, would just the boob right down the tube, and it was excruciatingly painful and not nearly as effective.
Uh-huh.
So I did give myself tendonitis in both wrists at various points doing the hand pump thing, but
Uh-huh. But you
it,
liked using a hand pump. Yeah.
that particular one worked best,
Oh, great.
for me. So,
Yeah.
and it wasn't terribly expensive, so
Yeah, they're like $20, something like
something
that.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I always tell people it's a nice option to have to throw in your bag for, some people prefer them over the double electric. Some people don't prefer them, but it's a nice thing to always have on hand in those moments when you lose a part for your pump or a ductile valve tears, or you just want to have it in your bag for when you're out and you don't want to carry a double electric breast pump, but you're going to be away from your baby for long enough that you'll need to pump. They're really, I mean, there's nothing, it's so nice to have a manual pump, to know that you can remove milk at any time and not need to plug in.
Right.
Yeah.
I was never exceptionally good at the manual removal, like the
Yeah.
doing it without a pump.
hand.
I could do it
Yeah.
when I was a bit engorged, but if I
Mhm.
wasn't engorged, then
It was a
I
little
was like,
harder. Yeah.
I was sort of very mediocre at that.
Yeah. Okay. So then there is a 10-year difference or an 11-year difference between your middle and your youngest. Is that right?
Yes, 10 years.
Okay.
10 years and a couple months.
Okay. So a 10-year difference. So you find out you're pregnant again. And you have a 10-year-old and an 11 or 12-year-old. So what are you thinking about as you enter into the scene of delivering a baby again? Was there anything that you changed as you went into birth and thinking about pregnancy and baby feeding this third time around, 10 years later?
Well, so I was definitely very surprised. In fact, I have multiple pictures of little pea sticks because I was like, "Nah, that one must be broken. No, that one must be." So yeah, turns out you can still get pregnant in your early 40s. But we, um, given the experiences I had had with the OB, although anyway, so I done my background. I have a master's in health communication. I've done a lot of. I'd in the interim done work with Boston Association of Childbirth Education and their Nursing Mothers Council, and done a ton of research, and I'd written a book about getting started with breastfeeding called Welcome to the Milk Bar with that same lactation consultant, and used to sort of introduce it, give a few general tips, and then like hand out the book to anybody who wanted it at the childbirth education classes at the hospital, blah blah blah. So I'd done a lot more, and one of the things I knew was that all the risks associated with a VBAC after 2 C-sections, given that it had been 10 years, my body was as healed as it could possibly be. We are not talking new scars at all. That most of those risks were significantly elevated by being at the hospital because of the interventions they would do, like wildly, like 10 times more likely. They want to give you Pitocin to move along the contractions, and it increases the very, very rare instance of the scar splitting to like 10 times as likely. It's still very rare, but it's no longer very, very, very rare. It's now 10 times less likely, less rare. You can see why I didn't ever try to teach statistics. But
right. That's how I talk about statistics too, but
right.
I see the point you're making.
Right. Like it's still not likely, but like,
right.
Why even, and the whole experience and everything. So I had a home birth midwife who was phenomenal. And so it was a very different situation. We did end up going into the hospital at the very end of labor the goal was to get some, what she referred to as therapeutic rest. Because I'd been in labor for 30 hours, I think, and had not really dilated. It turns out that, but the baby had turned to a much more helpful position, like rotated, not top bottom, but
right
around.
Yeah.
I'm gesturing in the air in a completely useless way for a podcast, but that's what I'm doing.
Yes, rotating is an image we can all put in our minds.
Right.
all of those of us who have had babies.
Anyway, so spun and circle. Anyway, so she so as we were preparing to leave, I went into transition, but at that point no one was available to notice, and I didn't know that's what it was, and so yeah. So we didn't actually needed to go, but we did go because we thought we needed to. And because delivery was very rapid after that. But we so I was in the hospital for like the actual coming out of the baby, no knives involved, and all kinds of ridiculousness with that. But I was also like, when they were saying, okay, so you're going to be here till tomorrow morning, and I was like, I was really hoping to leave today.
Mm.
So we left the same day.
Mm.
They and there was 1 hour where I collapsed into sort of a comatose sleep from the lack of sleep, because I'd gone into labor at 9 o'clock at night. So having had a full day, then went into labor and labored through the next couple of nights and days, with no rest. So my body kind of collapsed for 1 hour. But other than that 1 hour, the baby was always with me for that very short hospital stay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just as well, because that baby would sort of be attached to the breast all day,
Mm-hmm.
and would sort of sip and dribble. Yeah, that was shirts are for jerks, really. So uh so it was a very different sort of getting started. The lactation consultant I'd worked with before was no longer available, but I am confident that if I'd had any issues, my midwife would have either helped or gotten me connected with somebody that could have helped.
Yeah.
I mean, the midwife experience was so wildly different. Like, she came back the very next day, and then the day after, like there was like all these visits after.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the earliest pictures of that baby were taken by the midwife.
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah. So even though she was nursing kind of all day, she was being monitored by the midwives. Were they checking her weight when?
Oh yeah, they weighed her.
Yeah.
That was fun. The older kids also like to weigh things, and that because it's the
like hanging.
Yeah, with the little cloth thing.
Yeah,
and,
so fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, she was weighed and measured, and we did go to the pediatrician early on. So yeah.
And was your pediatrician supportive of the decisions you were making around home birth and feeding? Was it the same pediatrician you had for your 2 older children?
So I had switched pediatrician with the older children when they were fairly young, when my middleest was 2.
Okay.
And it was that same pediatrician, and he, in theory, was in favor of breastfeeding, but didn't always offer the best advice, and which was fine because I didn't need his advice, but didn't always, like, he was often learning from me about breastfeeding, particularly long term. So my older 2 breastfed until they were different months of the year, but more or less 4.5 and 6.5 years old. And they decided they were going to wean. It was very funny. They were with their father at like Target, and they saw some toy that we would not normally get for them. And for some unknown reason, in response to the asking for it, their father made a sort of joking comment of like, "Oh, if you think you're mature enough for that, then maybe you should wean," or I don't know, something like that. and so my middleest, who believes in the power of stuff, was like, "Okay, we can do that. I'll do that."
Oh my gosh.
So we ended up having a weaning party and trying to turn it into something positive.
Yeah.
And give them the thing that they had made the deal for.
Yeah. At that time, did you feel pretty ready yourself?
It was really funny because they were with their father by themselves, in part. I mean, like, we would usually all be together, because I was actually at a breastfeeding conference I had arranged with Nursing Mothers Council, and so that was it was a little bit funny. I mean, I was definitely ready to be done. It wasn't the way I would have chosen to do it. Trading something wholesome for something that we didn't support or believe in, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're all making these decisions at the spur of the moment that we think, that might not have been the best choice, but that,
right. It's like, all right, that's what we're doing. I turned it into something positive. It was good.
Yeah.
So, and it was actually, the older one was just like, "Oh, yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Whatever. So yeah, we we'd go in for annual visits, and the pediatrician was like, so are they still breastfeeding? And I was like, yeah. He's like, oh, okay. Do you think they're getting any milk? And I would explain to them what they were getting. He was like, oh, okay. So he was definitely learning more from me about breastfeeding at that point
Right.
than the other way around. Generally, he was on board with where we were at with stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think those were all the major differences. I
And
mean, it was also being starting over again.
that was the same pediatrician when you had your home birth with your daughter. And
With the littlest one, yeah.
he was kind of a key player in helping monitoring weight gain and all of those things that we look for. It's not the only thing we look for in making sure that a baby is getting enough milk, but it's one of many things we look at. And so was he a part of that, or was he not one of the primary people that you look to for information about health when it came to that?
I mostly looked to the baby,
Mm-hmm.
Is the baby perky or not? Is the baby, doing baby things, I guess. I don't know. And the midwife visited more frequently than we visited the pediatrician, just because we went for normal visits and whatnot. There were no particular concerns at that point.
Great. Yeah.
So, I mean, they both were, look, we're weighing the baby. Look, we're measuring the baby. Look, the baby's all perky and babyish.
Yeah. Right.
All is good.
Yeah. When you deliver in a hospital, then you come home, you're kind of on your own after that. You don't have anybody else helping you tune into the baby, especially if you've never done it before. Because you don't have that postpartum visit for about 6 weeks afterwards. Typically that first postpartum visit, unless there's something going on that requires that you go in earlier. And you do see the pediatrician within the first few days and with the first week or 2 weeks. But like you've mentioned, it's up to the pediatrician to educate themselves on breastfeeding. And so there's a wide variety on how educated they are on breastfeeding.
Definitely.
And so when you do opt for that midwifery care, you do have somebody who's helping you learn to tune into the baby, like you're saying, to be checked.
Right. I mean, she was very there for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
Very checking in. She knew my birth story and that trauma and why we were doing things differently, and
Mm-hmm.
she knew she knew me well. She was very funny. I was like, there's no way I'm gonna want a tub. Like, there's no way I'm gonna want the birthing tub. Like, that's just not my thing. I'll be in a shower probably, but I don't like taking baths. It's just not my thing. She's like, okay, well, it'll be in my trunk in case you change your mind. First thing out of my mouth as I went into labor was, where's the tub?
Yeah, that's so funny.
So
you mentioned that your third baby kind of was just an all-day nurser. Did that have any effects on you? Did you experience any pain, nipple pain, or any nipple trauma from that? Or did she have a good enough latch that you didn't experience any effects from that?
So the biggest problem we had, so my middleest had this to a lesser extent, and the youngest had it the most. And I can't remember. There's a name for it that has like one of those words and nobody remembers. But there is soft tissue in the throat, and when it's too loose as a newborn, it can cause them to gag and spit up or throw up, depending on how severe it is. If it's particularly bad, when they cry, they make a funny noise. It actually is really funny, the noise they make. But they, which makes it hard because you're like, the baby's sad or upset or whatever, and you're laughing but trying to also solve the problem at the same time. It's not good. So the youngest one had a lot of challenges with that, and the fact that I still overproduced and was a bit of a geyser and whatnot. So, so the baby definitely had a bigger challenge because the baby wanted to be attached all the time. They wanted to always be comfort nursing, but it was mostly discomfort nursing with
Mm.
upchuck. We used to refer to it as baby cheese because it was just enough fermentation.
Mm.
Um, so we ended up also adding a pacifier eventually. I was trying not to this time around, but it turned out to be really kind of necessary for so the baby could also get some comfort sucking without getting drowned in milk. um, so that was more of the issue with the all day nursing more than I didn't really run into problems with it that I can remember.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I mean, I definitely had like, the plug duck here and there with all three of them that you just sort of, massage out and it's fine. I never had mastitis. Um, and there was definitely times when things would be, I mean, there was that initial discomfort of the nipples getting to get used to the whole nursing concept in general, but not
Mm.
like no sores, no actual problems with it, just,
Mhm.
kind of like building a callus.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And then how long did your youngest end up nursing?
Till they were 5.5.
Mhm.
I don't really know why, but at the beginning of the pandemic, for some reason, I was just kind of like, okay, we're done. And they were like, what? Okay.
Mm.
I
You just
like,
felt ready.
yeah, there wasn't really a specific thought process behind it, but they were 5.5. So it's not like,
Mhm.
I cut them off at 5 weeks or 5 days or
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
But I couldn't tell you specifically why, and it was okay.
Mhm.
They were fine with it. Um,
So there was no real strong reaction.
no, I mean, like, there was definitely, um, gestures at, like, the habit of breastfeeding again when I'd go to put them to bed, but I would
Mhm.
sort of shift them around and snuggle them anyway, and it was
Mhm.
fine. Like,
Yeah.
they still get snuggles till they fall asleep and stories
Mhm.
and stuff, so it's fine.
Mhm. Yeah.
They rejected moving out of our bed much more so, even though they didn't fit anymore.
Mhm.
We gotten a mini crib. We live in the city, so our bedrooms are a bit small, and we have a queen size bed, and then we'd had a mini crib on one side, sort of attached like a sidecar kind of thing. But
Mhm.
figuring, oh, this is great because it'll last as long as they need to be. They eventually outgrew that and still weren't ready to leave the bed, and there wasn't enough space. And they had their own room, and so
Mhm.
they got evicted to their room. That definitely led to a lot more protest than stopping the breastfeeding, which happened at a different time, a little bit
Right.
later.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then you returned to work did you return to work away from the home ever by the time you had the third, or were you mostly able to manage keeping them with you at most of the time?
Sort of a yes to the above. So, while when my older two were 4 and 6, I um, I left the office I had been working for and started doing some freelance work and homeschooling with them. And then after I had the little one, um, a friend of mine who I had been looking at, so we've been sort of thinking about starting our own business, different ideas, and I was thinking about the idea of opening a local focused food store. And then after I'd had the first one, my friend's business, which was also local focused and food, but not a store, it was catering and a venue and a bunch of other things, was in need of a bookkeeper. And so she's like, "We'll teach you how to do that. I just need somebody I know will do the thing and that I can
Mm.
trust and whatever."
Mhm.
And so we did that for the first year. And so Thalia came with the little one, came with me everywhere.
Okay.
They were bar baby and office baby, and often managed to douse themselves in somebody else's dregs of beer or coffee
Mhm.
while we were from the recycling bin while I was collecting all the paperwork. And then I and then after I did that job, I we were starting to actually do that opening of the business. And so the little one, it continued to just come with me wherever I went, and
Yeah.
meetings and whatnot. And then we had the store opened right after they had turned 2. And the older 2 were 12 and 14. And they were, I mean, with the homeschooling lifestyle, we'd all gotten very used to just always being around. So like they would come to the store, or they would choose to be home. And so the little one was either with me or with older siblings.
Okay.
Um, and then we closed the store a year before the pandemic started. And I've started a different business that's delivering food directly from farms to people's homes. And so the little one, or sometimes one or more of the older ones, will come with me on farm runs.
Okay.
So
great. Well, I so appreciate you sharing your stories. I'll make sure to add your book. It's called, name the title for me one more time. Welcome to the Milk Bar.
Welcome to the Milk Bar. There was a e-version of it on Amazon. I'd have to look it up to see if it's even still there.
Okay.
But if people are interested in it, I can certainly get it to them. It was intended to be lighthearted and easy to access. It's very small, and when I bound it, I did it spiral bound specifically so you could lay it open. I had this fantastic artist do sort of gesture drawings so that you could get all the information you needed about like position and latch and stuff without getting bogged down in like race and ethnicity and sex and clothing and
great,
what decade the picture was taken and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
We and it kept it to like, what are the things you really need to know to get started. The intention was to have 2 other books, one for the partner, sort of support them in being supportive because of the way the research shows how crucial that is, and then one on sort of like older breastfeeding and weaning and that kind of thing, because there isn't a lot out there. I mean, there isn't a huge need, but there's definitely like a gap in support, at least at the time I was looking at it. And I never completed the other 2 books. So
yeah, well, you still have time.
Right? Not done yet.
So thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your stories. I think a lot of people are going to relate to a lot that you've been through, and your stories about having C-sections and then having that third VBAC, and listening to your own tuition about what your babies needed and tuning into them and what they were telling you they needed will be so good for so many people to hear. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Milk Making Minutes. I hope you found connection and feel supported wherever you are in your baby feeding journey. The views expressed in each interview are deeply personal and sacred, and I'm so grateful to each person who is generous enough to share their story. It is also true that those views are solely theirs and do not necessarily reflect my opinion or advice as a lactation supporter, and this podcast does not qualify as medical advice. If you are struggling to feed your baby, please seek out the support of a local IBCLC.